let's go ahead and get started. My name's Sarah. I work in programming with the Natural Areas Association, and I'm glad that you're joining us today. A little bit about who we are. The Natural Areas Association is a 40-year-old nonprofit. We provide networking, training, and advocacy for natural areas professionals. And we support your work in conservation and natural areas management by bringing you the latest science and best management practices through the Natural Areas Journal, which is a peer-reviewed quarterly publication, regional workshops, the annual Natural Areas Conference, and webinars, including this one. I encourage you to visit the Natural Areas Association webpage, naturalareas.org, to learn more about us, or better still, talk to a colleague who's a member. And now I'll hand it over to the Natural Areas Association Executive Director, Lisa Smith.
Hi, everyone. I, too, would also like to welcome you to this webinar today. Our guests, Theo, Witsell, and Jennifer Ogle, are going to present a program that we think serves as a great model for how programs with limited resources can leverage their partnerships to grow the right seed for natural areas restoration. As you'll hear about in a bit, NAA hosted a regional workshop in Central Arkansas with Theo and Jennifer to expose practitioners to this program back in May of 2019. And that workshop allowed for about 60 people to attend. And today we want to use this webinar to get this important information in the hands of even more practitioners. I see we've got about 160 people registered as of right now. So this is one of a series of webinars that we're offering this year that focus on the importance of native seed in natural areas restoration. And they've all been made possible and free to you through the generous underwriting of our partners at the Bureau of Land Management, Plant Conservation and Restoration Program, and through the in-kind support of partners like the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission. Not all are underwritten, and as a result, I'd like to encourage you today, for those of you who find this type of programming of value, to become members of NAA. It's one of the ways that we can support, that you can support us so that we're able to continue to offer this type of valuable resource to you. Times are changing for all of us, and while we plan to always offer important information and support to our community, we're faced with the challenge of funding this work. And I think you'll see in the near future that a membership in NAA will bring with it even more benefit to you, to those of you working in natural areas conservation. So thank you all for everything that you do for natural areas conservation, and thanks to those of you who are members. We look forward to continuing to serve you. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome today's speakers, Theo Witsell and Jennifer Ogle. Theo is an ecologist and chief of research for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission and the curator of the ANHC Herbarium. He has authored or co-authored more than 30 scientific publications and book chapters. And Theo founded and is chief ecologist for the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. He serves as a regional reviewer for the Flora of North America project as well. And Jennifer is the collections manager of the University of Arkansas Herbarium and coordinator of the Arkansas Native Seed Program. She also serves on boards and committees of organizations focused on urban land conservation and the protection of native plants and plant communities. Theo and Jennifer are co-editors of the Atlas of the Vascular Plants of Arkansas. They are also co-authors of the forthcoming field guide, Trees, Shrubs, and Woody Vines of Arkansas. Theo and Jennifer, I turn it over to you. Thanks again.
So Jennifer and I are gonna tag team throughout the presentation. I'll do a few slides and then she'll do a few slides. I just wanted to mention briefly that I was talking to Lisa, and I went to my first Natural Areas Association conference 25 years ago in Fayetteville, Arkansas, when I was an intern at the Natural Heritage Commission. So I've been there for a long time as well. Jennifer, do you want to say hi?
Hey everybody, I'm really happy to be here. I only attended my first NAA conference 2 years ago, so I'm a newbie in comparison, but I do want to say something right up front, that I've attended 2 conferences and one, the workshop we put on in Arkansas. And the Natural Areas Association, and Lisa in particular, who is a connector of people, has been instrumental in connecting us with people we needed to know outside of our state and region that have helped move this program forward. So we appreciate that so much, Lisa.
Very much. And the Natural Heritage Commission in Arkansas houses both the State Natural Areas Program, which is our system of state nature preserves, and also the State Natural Heritage Program, the database of the locations of rare and sensitive species of plants, animals, and natural communities. And that's a big part of this native seed program as well, as we'll get into. the Native Seed Program in Arkansas is a great partnership of a bunch of different organizations. We have all of the state and federal natural resource agencies in the state are partners, as well as several NGOs, and Roundstone Native Seed, which is a for-profit business, native seed nursery and producer. Two of the agency partners came forward and secured some funding, which got us where we are today over the last 2 years, which funded Jennifer Ogle's position as a contractor as the coordinator of the Native Seed Program. And that was the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, was the primary funder, with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife restoration grant funds. And there was some state match from the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, which is a division of the Department of Arkansas Heritage.
All right, so I'm just going to jump right into the Native Seed Program. Our goal is to develop eco-regional sources of locally adapted native seed for large-scale habitat restoration and revegetation projects in Arkansas. And so what I'm featuring on this screen is just a few of the plants that we have in cultivation, that Audubon Native Project has in cultivation right now in Arkansas. One of my first jobs as the coordinator of this program that I tackled was to develop a target species list for collection. It seemed like a really fun adventure to do, and it was. And so if any of you know Theo, and many of you do, you know that he already had a list developed, a wish list of target species in his head, and he wrote it all down. And it was supposed to be a species list, but what he handed me was actually a genus list. And it would say Helianthus, and it would say all the species. You know, we have 14 native species, and if we want to work in woodlands, then we can grab these as well. And so my job, you know, was to tell Theo no right off the bat, which was a hard thing to do. But actually, our list, his list was well over 250 species when we started. But there was a good reason for him to have all those species on the list. He wanted us to have flexibility in options for collecting seed. So be more opportunistic than just sticking with a strict list. So if we were in a natural area targeting one member of a genus, but we saw something else that was abundant and ready, he wanted us to be able to collect it. So our final list ended up being quite large, and I'll go into that in more detail in the program. But what I want to focus on is the background of this program. I think it's useful to know where we came from, and then also where we are and where we're headed with this program. The idea for a Native Seed Program in Arkansas is about 30 years old, and it started when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers announced that they were going to develop what was known as the Grand Prairie Irrigation Project, which was a network of pipeline and 184 miles of canals that would stretch from the White River into the Grand Prairie ecoregion and pump water into the Grand Prairie to relieve local aquifers. And that would result in about 3,000 acres of canal banks, these gently sloping canal banks throughout the Grand Prairie that would need to be revegetated. And ANHC staff saw an opportunity to use native seed on those canal banks. A little bit about the Grand Prairie and why that is important. The Grand Prairie is a center of rice production in Arkansas. It's also one of the leading rice producing regions in the country. Here it is on this the ecoregions map of Arkansas. It's surrounded by the Mississippi alluvial plain. It's quite large. It's about 1 million acres in size. It's different than the rest of the Mississippi alluvial plain, though, because it's older, flatter, and higher than the rest of that ecoregion. And it hasn't been influenced by river processes in about 100,000 years. What it has is a thin layer of loess, which provides a fertile topsoil for agriculture, and it has a thick clay layer beneath that, which provides a waterproof bottom. So it's ideal for rice production. Unfortunately, stretching back farther into time, historically, this was a region of treeless prairie and savanna before we settled it and converted it to agriculture. In fact, over 400,000 acres was just in tallgrass prairie. And this is a story that you all are familiar with. Everywhere that tallgrass prairie exists in North America, almost everywhere, it's been converted to agriculture. And so now our tallgrass prairies are some of the most critically endangered habitats we have left. And so that story is repeated here in the Grand Prairie. If you can see on this map, these dark red regions, this is what remains. in the Grand Prairie, less than 400 acres remains, and it's highly fragmented and very small pieces are what's left. This long line that runs east to west is the railroad prairie natural area, and it is a long, linear, very thin line of prairie that's left, bounded on one side by road and bounded on the other side by agriculture. We have also Downs Prairie Natural Area, which is just a small 20-some acre plot of prairie that's left that's also completely surrounded by development. Of course, the Grand Prairie is not the only place where tallgrass prairie historically occurred in Arkansas. We had extensive areas of grasslands, specifically tallgrass prairie, in several regions of the state, including tens of thousands of acres in the Ozarks, the Arkansas Valley, and the West Gulf Coastal Plain. In the West Gulf Coastal Plain, we have some of the most high quality examples of blackland prairie that are still in existence today. We know we have had historically a lot of prairie and savanna in the state. General Land Office surveyors came through in the 1830s or so, early 1800s, and mapped 750,000 acres of tallgrass prairie in Arkansas. And we know that they missed a lot. So they walked their survey lines and they recorded what they saw. Some surveyors didn't record tallgrass prairie. And so ANHC estimates that actually we have twice that number that was actually mapped of just open grasslands, not including savannas, which were also very extensive throughout the state, parts of the state. And so that's where our program is focused right now. Of course, we want to work in different plant communities, but grasslands are an important, very biodiverse plant community and critically imperiled. So we want to work in these regions primarily right now.
So this brings us back to natural areas and the role that they play. So Arkansas system of natural areas has 75 areas, about 70,000 acres, and it's scattered throughout the state. And we view that not just as a system of nature preserves, but as the seeds, literally, for restoration of much larger landscapes. Next. Why the natural areas? Well, for one thing, we've got the plants. These are some of the best, most biologically diverse remnant natural areas in the state. That's why we acquired them, and that's how we manage them for maximum plant diversity. We know that the populations of native species of plants on these areas are natural. They're not introduced in a wildlife planting. They weren't from seeds purchased 150 or 400 miles away in another state in another ecoregion. These are really the last of these remnant populations. And so and then there's that grassland connection. Because we target areas that are imperiled biodiversity or support imperiled biodiversity, then as sort of a definition, we're getting a lot of grasslands because those are the most endangered ecosystems that we have. There's some other reasons why we use the natural areas. They are great advocates, or they can serve as great advocates for themselves. You take someone to see something like this Flanagan Prairie Natural Area, and it's amazing. We like to demonstrate their relevance and importance for political purposes and to build constituency. We also use volunteers in a large part for the program. And getting the volunteers out working on the areas creates advocates. Next. These are just a few shots of some of the beautiful natural areas that are in the system. You can see that the flora is impressive at these areas. And these are areas that have been seed collection sites or will be in the future. Next slide. Back to that Grand Prairie irrigation project, which is really the first place we started thinking about using the natural areas as seed sources for other sites. This began back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we partnered with the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff to gather, at this stage, really just grass seed, and really mostly switchgrass is pretty much the main species. So it was a modest start, but they gathered switchgrass seed from a number of native remnant prairies in the area and propagated them in an agricultural setting. Their involvement sort of changed over time, and Audubon, Arkansas, which is the state affiliate of the National Audubon Society, became very involved about 2010 and since then. And Jennifer's going to talk more about this Project Native that's sort of taken over that Grand Prairie Ecoregion project. The natural areas, unfortunately, are not extensive enough, and there's not enough of them to capture the genetic diversity of these species that we'd like to have, a broad geographic and ecological diversity. We would like to have that represented. So we do use other sites, and we've targeted and identified particularly rights-of-way, utility rights-of-way, gas lines, power lines, roadsides, areas that we can vet and know that they're natural remnant native plant populations, not planted things, et cetera. Again, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer.
Right. I'm going to spend some time talking about Audubon, Arkansas's native project, because I know that's why many of you are here. You want to know how they're doing, what they're doing. I'm going to go into some detail on that. But as Theo mentioned, Audubon, Arkansas took over growing native grass seed for that Grand Prairie irrigation project in 2010, and they developed their native project. And this is an acronym for Native Agriculture to Invigorate Ecosystems, which just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Their objectives were, of course, to make genetically appropriate seed available statewide. And as a bird conservation organization, they wanted specifically to restore habitat for declining grassland birds at a landscape scale. And they also were interested in providing pollinator habitat. And so those are the three main objectives. They started working with UA Pine Bluff right away. UA Pine Bluff provided support. They connected them with farmers in the Grand Prairie region, and they also lent them equipment to harvest seed. They were instrumental in helping get Audubon started on that. The funding mechanisms for this native project have been USDA grants. They've had a series of conservation innovation grants and 2501 program grants. And if you're not familiar with the 2501 program, that's the short form of outreach and assistance for socially disadvantaged and veteran farmers and ranchers. So in the Grand Prairie, they were focusing specifically on disadvantaged farmers and veteran farmers. They also have received funding through an Arkansas NRCS grant. Additional support has been provided by program partners, notably the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, Roundstone Native Seed, the Nature Conservancy, as well as other partners. I'm going to go step by step through their process, and hopefully you'll learn something that will help in your models, or if you see something that we could be doing differently, I would love to hear from you. If you have recommendations, we're going to put our emails back up at the end, and you'll be able to email us if you'd like, if you have suggestions for how we're doing things. So at the very foundation of Arkansas's Audubon's native project is seed collection. And before we even get to the seed collection component, we engage agency botanists. So Theo is instrumental in this part of it. And this is where ANHC comes in on their grants, as they provide match in the form of staff time. They identify appropriate sites for collection. And then we often go into the field with volunteers during collection events and make sure they're collecting the right things. And also something that Theo's been using that I'm going to start using, I just learned about this, is I use iNaturalist, but I haven't used it for this purpose yet. He uses iNaturalist. He'll go while he's in the field and he'll mark a population that's worthy of collection, and he'll make sure the location is correct on the observation. He'll post that observation, and then he'll share it with Audubon and volunteers, so that when they go to collect, they can be sure to be right back in that same spot, so they know where those plants are for collection. That's been an important tool he's been using to help volunteers get to the right spot at natural areas. And then also, if a botanist or an ecologist can't be at an event, primarily Theo has been providing real-time plant identification. People will text message him questions and pictures, and he will ID those plants during collection events when he can't be there. So that's been very helpful. And of course, as Theo mentioned, we primarily collect from natural areas, but also other remnant populations that may not be protected, and rights of way. We make sure that those seeds were there historically, that they were not planted. That's a very important part of this project. We mostly do hand collection. And so this is where our volunteer force in Arkansas comes into play. We have a very impressive volunteer force in this state in the form of master naturalists, garden clubs, the Arkansas Native Plant Society, and just other volunteers who come out and help collect. I did see that Larry Price is on this chat. I know that he's a Project Wingspan volunteer. So hi, Larry, I want to give a shout out to you. I know you've been doing a lot of collection with your other volunteers through a pollinator partnerships project. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. So they're really the foundation for this whole project, the volunteers are. We can also do some machine collection. Audubon has a flail vac, and they can collect some species, some of the taller grasses they can collect with the flail vac. And more recently, we've acquired this machine. I found this in my travels while I was doing research for the strategic plan. I stumbled upon this at the Missouri Wildflowers Nursery, this push combine, and Audubon, Arkansas quickly bought one. So what it is, I'll explain this briefly. It's a hopper. It's made of aluminum, and there's a hopper here, and then there's a paddle wheel here, and it's fitted with mountain bike tires, so it can go into prairies and glades with hospitable terrain. It can also be used in agricultural rows that are a certain width. And then if you'll note here, it has a hedge trimmer affixed to the side. And then on the front, the protective bar is on this orange bar, but beneath that is the cutting blade. And so we're gonna show you a video here in a second, but what it does is you turn the hedge trimmer on, and then you just push it. It's not self-propelled, you have to push it. You push it through a natural area, and the hedge trimmer cuts the stalks, and then the paddle wheel pushes the stalks into the hopper. And so Sarah, if you would share your screen and share that video with us, I think it's worth seeing. So Ron's pushing this by himself. It's pretty lightweight. It's easy to push through. And what is he collecting, Theo? Remind me, please.
That is Rudbeckia grandiflora, the coneflower.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a good alternative if you have a small scale operation like we do for the most part. This is a good way to harvest seed for certain species. I didn't mention also that hopper can be raised and lowered to a certain extent. So it's pretty useful. It only costs $3,500. So for cash-strapped groups like us, it was a pretty good buy. All right, I'm gonna reshare my screen and move on. All right, we're gonna get more of those too, and have them in different ecoregions of the state, so we don't have to ship it over all the state. All right, the next step in Audubon's native project is seed processing. When the volunteers go out, they collect into paper bags for the most part. They always affix a label to each bag, and that label has the plant's name, the location it was collected from, including the GPS coordinates, the date it was collected, and the approximate size of the population from which we collected seed. All of that seed is harvested throughout late summer and into fall. And Central Arkansas Water, another one of our partners, has donated the use of a facility to store that seed for short-term storage until it can be sent, all gathered and then sent to Roundstone Native Seed in the wintertime. So Roundstone Native Seed is another one of our partners, and they've provided support to the Native Project through Match as well. They give the plugs and the plant materials at a reduced cost to this program. And so they process all the seed, and they grow the wildflower seed into plugs, as is shown on the right-hand picture. Those are plugs being ready for planting. And then the grass seed, they clean it and package it. And all the plant materials are returned to Audubon farmers. And I think it's worth noting that all of the seed that was collected within a natural area is returned to a farmer in that same natural area. We don't have to do it that way, but that's the way we do it now. And it does keep a really good separation distance between populations in different ecoregions. So it's effective at this time. There's a significant amount of preparation work that goes into the fields before these plants are installed. And so we have to get these fields bare ground. And oftentimes we're dealing with non-native agricultural grasses, fescue, Bermuda, and other hard to get rid of grasses. So we get it down to bare soil. And then if, in the case of a wildflower plot, it's organized into rows, and drip irrigation and plastic mulch are installed. And then behind that, they take a water wheel planter, and which punches holes in that plastic and a hole in the ground, and then people on the back of it install the plug. And then we have a quality control department that goes in behind them and makes sure that each of those plugs was properly placed in the ground. And when I volunteer with Audubon, that's my job. I'm always down on the ground, making sure those plugs are in the hole where they belong. Now the grass plots are very different. They're also prepped, we get it down to bare ground, but then the seed is planted with a seed drill or broadcast. And we're focusing on species. Most of these species are harvestable the year after we plant them. So following year we're harvesting. With the case of the Grand Prairie farmers where traditional agriculture is common, they have large scale equipment. And we plant grass seed on large plots, like 10 to 20 acres is the goal. And so these farmers in the Grand Prairie use their combines and they'll outfit them with rice harvesters, and they'll harvest the seed that way. But the wildflower seed is put in these smaller plots. They're more expensive to install, more labor intensive. And so farmers have to either hand collect, or we can use this new push combine in a lot of cases. We also engage volunteers to help them collect in certain cases as well. The next part of that process, and the most important part, is to dry the seed properly. That's something we're still working on. We need equipment to properly dry seed quickly. We're in a humid environment here, and so that's an important part of this process. We bag it up and then we put it in that storage facility for temporary storage until it can be sent back to Roundstone for processing. And at that point, it's all in Roundstone's hands, all of the seed. So they go through the processing, they analyze it for pure live seed basis, and they package and market it for the farmers. Farmers, of course, have the freedom to market their seed wherever they want, but so far every farmer has chosen to work with Roundstone, and that's been a really good arrangement for them. And they have worked out an agreement where they receive a percentage of profits from the seed sales. So as of 2020, we have nearly 100 acres enrolled in the native project on 11 farms in 4 ecoregions of the state: the Ozarks, the Arkansas Valley, the Blackland Prairie, and the Grand Prairie. And they have 26 species in cultivation. And here's that list real quick. I'm not going to focus on this too much. But what they do have is they have the big 4 native warm season grasses in cultivation, and then 22 wildflowers that are attracted to pollinators, are workhorse species for the most part. I'm going to go back to this screen really quick. I'm going to show you a series of slides to demonstrate just what these farms look like. I think it's useful to see that. This is a farm in the Ozarks. It's just outside of the city limits of Fayetteville, so it's really close to my house. I can go visit this farm, and you're going to see why you'd want to visit it here in a second. This was planted in fall 2019, and this is about a month ago. Beautiful. This is all bee balm, two rows of bee balm. In between these rows, the farmer has planted a low-grow fescue mix as recommended by Roundstone and Audubon, and it's working out really well for weed control. She doesn't need to mow it, but she does mow it because this farmer tends to manage this 2-acre plot as though it's a small garden, and she's really keeping up with it well. Here's another picture of it. This is Slender Mountain Mint in the foreground, and then just beyond that we have pale purple coneflower, a couple species of solidago, and I don't know if you can see this, but back in the distance is a prairie blazing star about to pop. And Nate Weston with Beaver Watershed Alliance posted some pictures on Facebook and tagged me on it, and it was just outstanding about 2 weeks ago, just alive with pollinators. It was amazing. Here's another farm. This one is in the Blackland Prairie. This is all sawtooth sunflower in the foreground here. You can see some weeds coming up between the rows. You might recognize this weed if you can see it. It's actually green milkweed, which is one of our target species. And so Jonathan Young told the farmer, that's one of our species we would like to cultivate. And so she didn't kill them, she let them grow, and she had ended up cultivating and collecting seed from them. That was pretty cool. This sawtooth sunflower, planted in fall of 2018, turned into this 12-foot tall, harvestable mass of plants just 1 year later. I know they couldn't use the push combine to collect it. I really don't know how they did it, but they did manage to harvest it. And then here we have another example of an innovative way to grow grass seed. This is a farm in the Grand Prairie. This farmer has several hundred acres in soybeans, rice, and corn. And so he's employed an NRCS practice here between the rows, using native warm season grasses as buffer strips. And so he can take his combine in and harvest the big blue stem on the right and the switchgrass on the left. And that's worked out really well for him. And the last slide I'll feature is a Grand Prairie farmer. This is Mr. Wofford. He has been enrolled in the Native Project longest, and he started out by planting native warm season grasses, and then he also decided to plant wildflowers once that opportunity came up. He's a teacher by training and profession, but he's an engineer and an innovator. And so he's been able to reconfigure some of his traditional agricultural equipment to be useful in this very different type of landscape and method of growing. So he's been real innovative and has actually helped the program along by coming up with equipment that could be useful for the program. One more thing before we move on from this, I wanted to highlight the Native Project because, for one, Audubon should be very proud of what they've done. They've developed this very innovative program, and now other states and other regions are looking to this as a model, as they should. And so I think it's really important to highlight the work that they've been doing. All right, Theo.
Okay, I'm going to just quickly give a little background in history. So before we started in the last 3 or 4 years, really started this whole thing. And before that, the Natural Heritage Program and other partners were big advocates of telling people, you know, we really should use locally collected, you know, ecoregional genotype seed for these restoration projects. You know, it's not good to be buying stuff from Minnesota or Florida necessarily for these sites. We want to protect the genetic integrity of our, or the genetic biodiversity of our native species here. And people understood that, and they said, well, yeah, okay, we're in agreement. We'd like to do that. Where do we get the seed? And the inevitable answer would be, well, there is no seed. You'll have to go out and collect it. We'll give you a permit, let you go to the prairie natural area and collect, and then you guys can sow your seed out there. And they'd say, well, you know, we have money to buy seed, but we really are not in a position to be able to do all that work. And more often than not, things would end up, you know, they'd purchase it from somewhere else. Eventually, we sort of understood and accepted that if we wanted people to do what we were asking them to, we were going to have to participate and enable the development of strains of these seeds, the commercial availability of these locally collected seeds. We were really inspired in 2015 when the National Seed Strategy came out. That was a big lift for kind of letting us see what's possible, what we might be able to do here. We formally launched, at least in name, the Native Seed Program in 2016. All the partners on that second slide began to meet quarterly and talk about how we wanted things to happen, advocate for this. And at that time, you know, there was this practice of saying, okay, well, you do this, here's our take-home assignment. You know, you start writing the seed plan and you can do this, and you go look at demand. And everyone's already overbooked and overwhelmed with their day-to-day job. So this was not a sustainable situation. Nothing was really getting done. So we knew we'd need to hire somebody. And at that time in Arkansas, and even still today, the agencies are kind of in a state of contraction. So we're not able to add staff. We need bodies doing work. We need brains and bodies getting this work done, but we can't hire any more staff. Even if we have money, we can't hire staff. So luckily, we were able to get authorization to basically do contracts and have a contract employee, and that was Jennifer, to be the seed coordinator and kind of help things get pushed along. We went in 2017, folks from Audubon and Natural Heritage, to the National Native Seed Conference in Washington, D.C. And really that was like, kind of blew our minds a little bit. Letting us interact with all these people that really knew what they were doing and had been doing this for, in some cases, decades. We had a great conversation with folks from South Texas Native Seeds, and they said, yeah, you need a plan. We were telling them about our plan. We were working on a plan. You need a plan, but you just got to get out there and start doing stuff, and you're going to figure this stuff out. So we hired Jennifer with that funding I mentioned from Game and Fish Commission and Heritage. And she had a number of responsibilities in her contract. The biggest one was to write the strategic plan, but also to determine the appropriate seed zones, to develop this refined list of target species, and determine research needs. That's a big part. We want to do research, we want to fund research, specifically genetic research, to sort of help us get at these seed zones and what's appropriate and maybe what's not. And that's on the way. These seed transfer zones we came up with, heritage ecologists and other partners, based largely on level 3 and 4 EPA ecoregions. We think of everything we do in terms of ecoregions, but it's not a straight one-to-one correlation between sort of these provisional seed zones that we came up with and those ecoregions. We took more than just the geography into account. We looked at landform, geology, soil type, even placement in the landscape. So switchgrass on some dry, rocky, glady ridge in the Ouachita Mountains may be very different than one in a valley bottom prairie. They look very different. They behave ecologically different, even in a common garden. So there's some differences that we took into account, even within an ecoregion. So these may change over time. We acknowledge they're not perfect, but we wanted to kind of strike the balance between what we think is right and the best practice and what's feasible. And it's a tug of war, but we're trying that. So here's an example of an ecoregion. I mean, a seed collection zone that spans 2 ecoregions. The Boston Mountains is the southern part of the Ozark Highlands, and it is rugged and is the highest part of the Ozarks. It's acidic, mostly geology with sandstone. It is very similar to what we call the Arkansas Valley Hills level 4 ecoregion in the Arkansas Valley. And it's so similar that we think that's fine to mix seed across that zone. Next slide.
All right. That was one of my responsibilities, and luckily Theo and Tom Fotide got it all figured out before I even came on board. So that was done.
Yeah.
But really,
Right.
You did. But I had several other things I was doing. One of the most important was to determine current demand. And we looked at the National Seed Strategy. That's in goal 1, is to determine seed needs. So we took that to say, what's the demand for seed in Arkansas? So with the help of partners, we developed a form that we sent off to all the state and federal agencies and organizations working in Arkansas and planting seed. And we asked them for the numbers of pounds and acres covered of seed over the last 5 to 6 years. And the question was, can we sustain an industry for native seed in Arkansas? And we came up with nearly 16,000 acres a year are being covered in seed by these organizations and agencies. And so the answer was yes, we can sustain an industry. So that was an important thing that we needed to work through. Back to those target species lists, I mentioned this already, but we did focus on workhorse species. So we wanted these species to be widely distributed and ample supply of them in each ecoregion they occur in. We wanted them to have broad ecological amplitude, and we wanted them to be relatively easy to propagate. And for the most part, the species on our list are workhorse species. But we also wanted to focus on the ecological value to wildlife. So that was another top goal with this target species list. Another thing that Theo mentioned is to determine research needs, genetics in particular. We've decided that as funding becomes available, we will work on genetics of populations of a species in different seed zones. And it may be that over time, we develop species-specific seed zones based on that research. Another important thing we were clued into during our conversations with staff of the Chicago Botanic Garden was research that's been done on intraspecific ploidy variation. And so now that we've developed that target list, we can start to look at each one of those species to see if that species tends to does have chromosomal differences in different populations. If it does that, if it does, then when we go to a population to collect it, we will need to test to see if the ploidy levels are the same within different populations in a seed zone. That's going to be a very important factor in some research that we will need to fund right away. We want to make sure that our mixes are compatible. And if we have different ploidy levels represented in a mix, that would lead to a reduction in fertility in our mixes, which we want absolutely to avoid. And of course, the main thing, the product at the end of this whole 2-year project I worked on was the strategic plan. And I want to emphasize that it did take 2 years of research, but also collaboration with groups like the Natural Areas Association who, because I was a member, I was able to collaborate and be connected with other groups. And also, I can't tell you how instrumental that was in connecting us with experts in seed banking, experts in plant materials development. And then also I did a lot of traveling and visited with other state and regional programs during this 2 years to inform me about the strategic plan. I visited with staff at the Tallgrass Prairie Center in Iowa over the period of several days, and they connected me with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, who has their own program for plant materials development, as well as the Seed Certification Agency in Iowa. I traveled to Texas and visited with the Texas Native Seeds folks, and they were extremely helpful. All of these groups I visited with were very generous with advice and help that we used to write the strategic plan. And so that's done. I submitted that at the end of June, and it's in review, and we should have a finished product very soon that we can share with potential partners and potential supporters and funders of this program. Here, real briefly, is an excerpt from our 85 species long target species list. As you can see, I'm showing you this because I want to show you how we've diversified what's in the mix. We have those perennials, we have those native warm season grasses, but we've also thrown some annuals into the mix, hemiparasites, cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and also we threw in some shrubs because there's a high demand for shrubs, particularly for stream bank restoration and stabilization projects in Arkansas and beyond. And so we want to keep that in mind as we move this program forward, that we might move into shrubs as well. Real quick, some of the things we're working on that we haven't fully developed yet. Develop demand, that's a big one. We want to incentivize the use of this seed that we're growing. And we've looked to the Virginia Pollinator Smart Crew. And as you may know, they have an incentives-based program that they've developed for the solar industry to use native seed on solar facilities. We have a much smaller solar industry here, but that's an area where we might incentivize the use of locally sourced native seed. There are other areas as well that we're exploring. We need to train volunteers to collect seed using established protocols. We need to work on that. The Seeds of Success program is of course the guide that we use to see how large a population should be, how many seeds we should be collecting. You and I had been talking about developing a workshop style training program for volunteers. A lot of our master naturalists in particular like citizen science focused projects. And so we were developing the idea of a workshop, and Theo and I are both involved with herbaria. We both manage herbaria. And so we're big advocates of collecting voucher specimens and depositing those into an herbarium. So that was going to be part of it. We would issue volunteers a plant press, groups of volunteers. We only have so many plant presses, and they would collect a voucher specimen that would be deposited in a local herbarium as proof that this seed is what we say it is. It came from this plant. Well, as we were developing that program, the pandemic hit and shut things down. And this was very much an in-person workshop. So we're reworking that to be, we might have to go virtual with that. But in the meantime, Pollinator Partnership has come into Arkansas. They've expanded their Project Wingspan program into Arkansas this year. And so they'll be here for at least 2 years. And they have a very good established protocol for seed collection. And so we're partnering with them right now, and they're training volunteers, and we're encouraging our volunteers to go through that training program as well. And so that was just great timing, actually. I know Sarah is on this call right now, and if you're interested in volunteering, you can go to pollinator.org, and you will eventually connect with Sarah Wittenberg, who will direct you how to be trained in seed collection. And then the two very big things we need to do is increase short and long-term seed storage capacity. We currently don't have that at all in Arkansas. And that goes back to flexibility. If we see a species in the field that we want to collect, right now we have nowhere to store it. And so we need to increase that capacity. We need to create that capacity so that we can store seed that we want to collect right away, so that we have it ready for future projects that we need to use it on. And then also develop sustainable ecotypes of target species. We need to increase the number of populations from which we're collecting. We need to hold back some of that seed and put it in short or long-term storage. And the goal of that is to increase the genetic diversity of our seed mixes within an ecoregion, because we think they'll be more climate resilient and just in general more resilient and more adapted to the conditions that we're subjecting them to. So those are the big things that we're working on right now with the seed program.
So we'll just end up here talking about what's to come and where we'd like to see things go from here. The 2-year grant that we had to fund Jennifer's position ended at the end of June. So that is done with and that money is gone. We have talked to a lot of other people, as we've mentioned, that gave us some great advice. And one of the things that we heard multiple times was the utility and the benefits of having a nonprofit, a standalone, single-purpose 501c3 nonprofit to sort of run the seed program. And we really like that idea. There's been a number of frustrations. Many of you probably work for state agencies, and there's the political push and pull and the changes over time with new administrations and the resistance to adding any staff. All of these things have been a headache. If we had a 501c3 that could not only hire people as needed, but also receive donations and solicit donations from philanthropic donations and receive grants, that would be a lot of benefits there. And so we are pursuing setting that up, learning what that entails. And I think that's going to be our model going forward. Of course, the board of directors of that organization could represent a number of the partners and other interests that would need to be represented. And already in the last several weeks, we've had interest from a philanthropist who's interested in helping us get a facility and is donating or offering to donate this 6,500 square foot former egg processing barn and retrofitting it as needed to house the native seed program in northwestern Arkansas. And we're in the process. We've just met with knowledgeable people from South Texas natives who've given us a lot of great advice on the layout of a building like this. It's also land around it for greenhouse space, production plots, etc. So we're excited about things to come, and we're committed to making this go forward.
And I will add just one more thing about this. What we see if we do form this nonprofit, we see us being a support system for existing programs, specifically for Audubon's native program. We see this facility as being where we can store seed and do seed increase and then provide that seed to Audubon to grow so that they're not constantly having to restock their seed stores. So hopefully this will just go as planned, and that in a year we'll do another webinar and you'll be hearing about all the progress we've made on that front. So here's just some selected references we used to develop this presentation. Of course, we did a lot more research than that, but these are some important pieces of information. And then here's our contact info. If you want to email us, please reach out to either one of us. And if we can't answer your question, we'll be sure to direct it to the right person.
Great, thank you, Theo and Jennifer, for that presentation. We've got a lot of interesting questions. Thank you for sharing both the background of how you built the program and also what the program's up to, down to kind of nuts and bolts, how you do what you do. I think that's great information for everybody, so thank you for going into depth. We do have a bunch of questions. We've got about 9 minutes before the end of the hour, so let's get into some questions. For everyone who's joining us, feel free to continue to enter questions into the chat function. We'll get to as many as we can. I'd also say that it's a safe bet to contact Theo and Jennifer after the webinar with follow-up questions. So let's just dive in here. Andrea had a question early on. How do you learn about the seeding history of a site where you're collecting, whether the plants were planted or grown naturally?
I'll take this one. In the cases of the natural areas, we have a pretty good idea of the land use history. All of these prairie remnants, I think without exception, survived to present day as meadows and they were never plowed. And you can tell by the plants that are there that they're remnant ancient old growth grasslands. So that part's easy. The challenges come up on these roadside places especially. And what we do there is work with the Department of Transportation and their biologists who have records of any sort of planting that's gone on, at least as recently as people were wildflowers. So, you know, and if they have good records, so that's pretty easy. If there's any question, we'll avoid the site. You can often look in the adjacent or whatever to these rights of way, especially in a power line, and you can tell if the same species are off in the woods. Well, you know you're in a good site. There's been a few sites where we weren't real sure, but usually based on what's there.
Okay. So it's really about reading the site. So kind of switching gears here, Gregory asks, do you anticipate someday expanding the scope of work to include timbered communities in the Ozark region? And how would that field work differ given the different terrain in the Ozarks?
Yes, absolutely. We would do that. It would certainly be shadier, right? Collection work would be maybe more pleasant. Rain, though, some of it's pretty rough up here, so it would need to be done by hand. Wouldn't you say, Theo? A lot of that in more wooded areas?
Yeah. You know, most of the demand for this seed is to go into open habitat. So, you know, it's a logical place to start. It's usually going into an old field or an agricultural field or a pasture or something along those lines. We do have some interesting sites on state natural areas where we're trying to restore savanna. We're experimenting with, do you put in trees first and let them get large enough to withstand fire and then restore the ground layer, or do you do the first and grow the trees somewhere else and bring them in? There's different, we don't know what we're doing really, but we're experimenting, trying to learn how to do that.
Okay. We've had a couple of people ask about whether there are concerns about sustainability when you're harvesting native plant and natural areas. Yeah, if you could address those general concerns, how do you make sure that you're not over harvesting seed in a given site?
Well, we do require permits for any entity gathering seed on the natural area. So that lets us keep up with who's collecting and how much. And we don't collect everything that we find. Most of the things we collect are perennials. So, I mean, yes, you're taking some potential future generation, some percentage of a potential future generation off the site when you collect, but a lot of these are really long-lived plants. And I think we don't feel like we're doing any major damage by collecting seed, but we don't collect every year from every site either. So we try to be cognizant of that and following some of the protocols that other states have. You know, they're out there, and we're not collecting more than a certain percentage of the seed at a given event, or from a specific region of the site. Most of the prairies are much larger than the sites where we actually do a collection event. We might collect in a tenth of the area in a given event. So we're conscious of it, but we're not worried about it at this point.
Okay. We had several questions about the farmers that you work with, how you've connected with them, how they're incentivized to participate in the program, how their seed reaches the market. I think Jonathan was answering some of those questions in chat, but if you could maybe elaborate on the role of the farmers and how they're brought into the program, that would be great.
Yeah, the Audubon does a media release, or they promote this program as widely as they can, and that involves the partners too, who have maybe a more specific reach. For instance, in the Ozarks, since I've been involved, they were trying to break into the Ozarks because we don't do traditional agriculture here in the Ozarks. We don't have the equipment, we don't have those types of farmers. So in order to break into this area, we partnered with Beaver Watershed Alliance, who has a very large reach in this region. And they hosted us to give a speaker series. And we found, I think, Jonathan, 3 farmers in the Ozarks, 4. Actually, one might be River Valley, but yeah, we found 3 to 4 farmers in the Ozarks through that outreach. It's very important to partner with groups that maybe have a more localized focus and have a big outreach within that area. What was for other questions there? How is it incentivized? The grant, and I didn't mention this, but each farmer enrolled in the program is paid a stipend of $350 per acre. And then also they keep a percentage of the profits from the seed that goes to market through an agreement they've made with Roundstone.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. There are a couple questions that came up related to climate change. Just asking generally, is the current strategy for seed collection adequate for future climate conditions? This is a question from Maggie.
I hope so. I guess the short answer is we don't know for sure. A lot of the areas we collect from, these remnant ancient grasslands, habitats from really different climatic times, typically hotter and drier. Now we're experiencing hotter and wetter. The idea behind maximizing the genetic pool within a seed collection is that, like, blending these populations from within an ecoregion, is that some of the genes will have a better chance of thriving on a specific site, whether it's soil drowsiness or how much water there is or wind or whatever. You know, the more genes you have in that pool, the higher likelihood you have of some of them being successful on that site. We hope so, but we don't know, I guess, is the honest answer.
Okay. I think you partially addressed the next question from Gregory. He's asking about the balance between genetic purity and genetic diversity and how climate change influences your willingness to accept genetic material from a wider geographic range. Anything to add to that?
Good question. I think the sort of assumptions that we're making, and we acknowledge that they're assumptions, is that we want to try to do it within the seed zone we've picked. If things fail, and as we do genetic research, which we want to really have a research component to our program, we would be open to where the science takes us and the experience takes us, where, you know, how we see how things perform. But to start off, we're gonna try to keep it within those regions.
All right. Well, I just want to acknowledge we're at the top of the next hour, so a big thank you to Theo and Jennifer. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot about what's going on and what's possible in native seed collection and restoration work. I know that the audience did too. Thank you everyone who attended. We appreciate your time. We hope we found the webinar useful. I also want to thank our sponsors at the Bureau of Land Management, the Plant Conservation Program, for their support of this webinar. Thanks everybody for attending and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.